Gredja. The swamp did not sleep. Even when the mist lay heavy and the moon was drowned by clouds, the waters shifted with the endless groaning of frogs, the restless turning of unseen fish, and the hiss of night things pushing through reeds. For Gredja, the swamp's ceaseless murmur was not a disturbance but a comfort, a constant reminder that silence belonged to the grave. And she had clawed her way back from that silence long ago. She crouched at the mouth of her crooked hovel, a hut stitched from moss and driftwood, and let the acrid smoke of her fire curl into her lungs. The bitter taste steadied her. It reminded her of the bargain she had broken, of the oath she had twisted, of the man she had once been forced to serve. Renvarde River Rush. The name still rang in her mind like a hammer striking an anvil, sharp and merciless. He had been young when she first knew him, not yet crowned in the shadowed glory that later made men bow their heads and women avert their eyes. To Gredja, he was a memory of fire and iron, of hands too cruel to be gentle and a tongue too silver to be honest. She had not chosen him, no woman ever truly did. And when he rose in power, weaving his dominion with spells stolen and bargains perverted, she had slipped into the wild to escape his reach. But escape was not freedom. His mark lingered on her skin, not in scars alone, but in the twisting of her soul. Every day she carried his cruelty in the marrow of her bones, until in time, she ceased to be the woman she had been. Now she was something else. A hag. The thought no longer carried sting. Hag was a word sharpened by others' tongues, a curse meant to shame. She had taken it into herself as armor. If she were monster, so be it. Better monster than victim. Better terror than prey. And tonight, she would set the first stone of her revenge. The fire snapped, spitting sparks into the damp air. Gredja stared into the flames and saw, not the wood consumed, but the memory of her own consumption. She had been little more than a girl when Ronvad first found her. He had walked with the confidence of one already certain of destiny, a man who had tasted the secrets of darker arts and found them sweet. She remembered his voice, coaxing, promising. He told her she was special, that she had power in her blood waiting to be woken. He spoke of rivers bending to will, of winds carrying names across distances, of stones whispering truths, if only the right tongue touched them. And she had believed. The memory burned, shame mixing with rage. Belief had been her downfall. For weeks, he trained her, if training was the right word. He fed her scraps of knowledge, and then demanded sacrifices in return. The sacrifices began small, a lock of hair, a night's labor mixing foul herbs. Then larger, her dignity, her will, her body. Renvad Riverrush hollowed her like a gourd, scooping out what was human and leaving space for his own shadow. When he left her behind, climbing the ladder of power to higher circles, she thought it a release. But the emptiness remained, widening each year until the swamp itself seemed to seep into her. The reeds whispered her name. The mud clung to her feet, as though claiming kinship. The toads sang in a chorus that only she could hear. Hag, hag, hag. And she answered, yes. She learned what the swamp offered. Blood in water became ink for binding. Frogs' eyes could see the thin places between worlds. The roots of willow drank sorrow and gave back whispers of the dead. Slowly, the ugliness inside her took form in her body, her back bent, her hair thinned and grey, her teeth sharpened like stones. What had been forced upon her became weapon. What had been curse became power. Now, when she traced the scars Renvad had left, she no longer felt only grief. She felt purpose, lure. But power alone was not vengeance. Vengeance required cunning. Renvad Riverrush was not the same man he had been. He had grown into a warlock whose name carried weight in hidden courts. He commanded followers, spread fear, and sought ever greater relics to tighten his grasp on dominion. A hag of the swamp was beneath his notice, unless she had something he wanted. So Gredja prepared the bait. The artifact did not exist, not truly, But Renvar did not need truth. He needed temptation. She chose her lure with care, a vessel she called the Shard of Umbrith. Supposedly the fragment of a mirror once carried by a forgotten god. In her story, the shard showed not reflections but possibilities, paths untaken, futures unwritten. To a man like Renvard, who clawed always for more power, such a relic would be irresistible. Crafting the deception took months. She carved a jagged piece of obsidian, black as starless night, and inscribed its surface with runes stolen from forgotten tombs. She bathed it in swamp water mixed with her own blood until the stone drank greedily. Then she built its legend in whispers. Travelers heard rumors of a hag who had bound a god's memory. A merchant spoke of a black stone that turned his shadow against him. A dying priest muttered of reflections that screamed. Each rumor was a thread, and Gredja wove them into a net she knew Renvard could not resist. Warlock's shadow. At times, she questioned whether he still remembered her. To Renvard, she had likely been one of many. Another body used, another pawn discarded. But she remembered him in such detail that her skin sometimes shivered, as if his hand still lingered on her. His smile, his voice, the way he spoke her name when coaxing obedience. It was all etched into her marrow. She knew his hungers. Power above all, but also pride. To deny him was to wound him. To trick him was to challenge him, and she would do both. She rehearsed the meeting in her mind. She imagined the look in his eyes when he saw her, aged and twisted, no longer the girl he had broken. She imagined the moment he reached for the shard, believing it his, only to find the snare beneath. Yes. That thought sustained her through the long hours of night. Preparations, revenge could not be rushed. Gredja tended to every detail. She reinforced the wards around her hovel so no spirit could betray her before the time was ripe. She fed the swamp with offerings, dead animals, stolen trinkets, her own blood spilled, on full moons, so that it grew restless, awake, and ready to answer her commands, and she wove herself deeper into the lie. When traders passed through the swamp's edge, she let them glimpse the shard, cradled in rags, gleaming with unnatural light. She allowed a wandering priest to steal a look at it, knowing he would flee in terror and spread word of its unholy vision. She even whispered to the wind, calling old spirits to carry the rumor farther than her voice could travel. Each step was a thread pulled tighter. Each whisper was bait laid sharper. At last, she heard his name in return. Renvard Riverrush, searching. Renvade Riverrush, hungering. Renvard Riverrush, coming. Memory. On the eve of his arrival, Gredja sat alone in her hovel and let the memories wash over her. She remembered the first time he struck her, not with hand, but with word. "You are nothing without me," he had said, voice like honey poured over rot. She had believed him then. Belief had been the cruelest chain. She remembered the night he left, promising return, never looking back. She had crawled into the swamp that night, broken and bleeding, whispering prayers to gods that would not answer. Only the swamp had listened. Only the swamp had whispered back. And she remembered the slow change, the way her reflection warped in. Water, the way her laughter became rasp, her tears became curses. The girl had died there, and in her place the hag had risen. Now the hag would have her justice. The moment approaches. The air thickened, as night deepened. Gredja stood at the doorway of her hovel, the shard wrapped in cloth against her chest. The swamp whispered restlessly, sensing what came. She inhaled the damp, fetid air, and let it fill her lungs. He was coming. Renvade Riverrush, the warlock who had broken her, was walking into her snare. She had lured him with shadows, baited him with lies, but it would be enough. Men like him always thought themselves too clever to be deceived. Pride would carry him into her circle, and vengeance would hold him fast. Gredja's lips curled in a smile that was more snarl than mirth. The time of waiting was over. The time of reckoning began. She whispered into the mist, a promise both to herself and to the swamp that had birthed her new self. Renvade Riverrush, you are mine. The swamp lay thick and silent under the new moon, the fog coiling like serpents across the waterlogged ground. Gredja's hut, little more than a hovel built from driftwood and reeds, seemed almost swallowed. By the night, the light of a single iron-bound lantern flickering against the mist. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but anticipation. The blood oath she had crafted over years, bound and fermented like fine wine, would now find its consummation. At the edge of the swamp, the dying willow awaited. Its bark was grey and split, the branches hanging low, as if weighed down by centuries of sorrow. The air smelled of rot and moss, pungent and intoxicating. Gredja approached it barefoot, feeling the cold, slimy mud press against her soles. She carried with her the implements of her craft, a dagger forged from black iron, dulled to avoid rusting, and a vial of her own blood, drawn carefully over the course of the past 3 days, and preserved with powdered nightshade to keep its potency. The warlock was somewhere nearby, beyond the circle's perimeter, thinking he could impose his will upon her. He had underestimated 40 years of solitude, and the subtle cunning that only long isolation could foster. His arrogance would be his undoing. Gredja knelt before the willow, letting her long grey hair brush the wet earth, and set the dagger to her palm. A deep breath, a whisper of the old tongue, and the blade pierced her flesh. Pain bloomed sharp and hot, but she welcomed it as a lover's caress. Her blood welled and pooled in her palm, warm and metallic, and she tilted the dagger, to draw a line from her heart to the circle etched in the mud around the willow. Each step was deliberate, each line of blood a conduit, a channel for the energy she had spent years cultivating. The circle glimmered faintly where her blood touched the soil, a dark red shimmer that seemed to writhe like liquid fire. She could feel the warlock's presence now, the pulse of his dark energy pressing against the thin membrane of the ritual space. He did not speak, he knew not to. Words, after all, were the currency of binding, and she intended to twist his own into chains. Gredja's lips moved silently at first, drawing on her own memory of his oath, the promises he had made, the arrogance threaded through each clause, the faint contempt for her existence. She shaped the words into a curse, threading them with her own venom and craft. As your debt to me, so your flesh shall cling to my chosen vessel, live as tree, die as root. The words were not merely spoken, they were poured into the blood, soaked into the mud, absorbed by the willow. The dying tree trembled, its branches shivering as if waking from a long, troubled dream. Roots writhed beneath the mud, seeking the blood like hungry worms, and Gredja felt the willow awaken, the ancient spirit within responding to her call. She whispered again, letting the words spill over her tongue and into the night. Bark and bone, branch and vein, take him into your slow, patient pain. Let him twist and writhe, a prisoner of his own debt. Root him, bind him. Let him never walk free again. The air thickened, as if the swamp itself were holding its breath. Fog curled more tightly around the willow, and the warlock, sensing the change, stepped cautiously into the circle. Gredja felt the hum of his energy against the threads she had laid. Felt his hesitation. Perfect. Hesitation made him pliable, made the binding stronger. She stood, lifting her hands to the sky, palms smeared in blood, and began to chant in a voice low and terrible. Each syllable was a twist of sinew and will, a twisting of the natural order. The warlock tried to resist, but the circle's power pressed against him. First like a weight, then like tendrils wrapping around his limbs. You swore to me, Gredja said, her voice calm now, deadly calm, and so you shall pay. Flesh for flesh, soul for soul, life for debt. The willow groaned. Bark split, sending slivers like teeth outward, and the roots lashed out, snaking through the mud toward the warlock's feet. He stumbled, trying to retract his magic, but each motion only tightened. The invisible cords she had woven around him with blood, salt, and will. Gredja approached, running a hand over the warlock's shoulder, feeling the flesh turn rigid beneath her touch. He gasped, trying to pull away, and she smiled, tasting the fear in his aura like the tang of iron. She whispered once more, and this time the words were carried by the wind, curling into the branches of the willow. Become what you sought to control. Let your life be claimed by the thing you underestimated. Let your limbs turn to wood, your skin to bark, your eyes to hollow knots that see but do not understand. A shiver ran through the swamp as the transformation began. Gredja felt it through her blood, a ripple that ran from her heart down the line. She had drawn, into the mud, through the roots, and into the warlock's very being. His skin darkened, bark-like ridges forming where sinew once was. Fingers lengthened and fused, cracking as they split into multiple thin branches. Limbs bent and swelled, curling upward into the skeletal mimicry of a willow's boughs. His eyes receded into hollow knots, leaving a faint flicker of recognition. The agony was exquisite and complete. He tried to scream, but the sound came out as the rustling of leaves, the groan of bending wood. His voice, his will, even the arrogance that had fueled him, all became part of the tree. He was no longer a man but a vessel, a prison carved in living wood. Gredja knelt once more and pressed her bloodied palm to the trunk, letting the final essence of her power flow through the veins of the tree. "This shall bind you for all time," she whispered, "unless one dares break the circle, unravel the blood, and risk their own soul in the attempt." The ritual was almost complete, but Gredja knew the cunning of others would not rest. She sprinkled powdered iron and silver into the roots and across the circle's perimeter, ensuring that even the faintest tampering would cause pain, or worse, lure the intruder into the swamp itself. The willow's roots twisted, sunk deeper, anchoring the warlock within the muck. She felt the willow pulse with his essence, a living, breathing trap that waited patiently for the ages. Hours passed. The fog shifted. The moon, though invisible, moved across the night sky, marking the completion of the ritual. Gredja traced the circle one last time, whispering protective wards and runes into the bark, sealing the binding in layers of her own arcane craft. Each rune, each whisper, each line of blood was a safeguard against meddling. Even she, with all her power, could not undo this lightly. The warlock, now fully part of the willow, was gone from the physical world, but present in a new, terrible form. His mind twisted in the branches, his memories flowing into the veins of the tree, feeding it, nurturing it. The swamp seemed to sigh in relief, as though it had been waiting for this moment for centuries. Gredja stepped back, wiping the blood from her hands onto her robe, leaving streaks that would stain forever. Her face was pale and lined, but her eyes glimmered with satisfaction and dark triumph. The forest, the swamp, even the night itself seemed to acknowledge the power she had wielded. She had taken the debt owed to her and turned it into something eternal, something more than mortal cunning could hope to overcome. Her gaze lingered on the willow, now alive with the trapped warlock, and she smiled. Not with joy, but with the cold calculation of survival. This tree was her safeguard, her sentinel, and her revenge made manifest. Others would come, curious or foolish, and they would find only the same despair that the warlock had known: pain, restraint, and the absolute futility of defiance. Yet even in her triumph, Gredja knew she would need more. The swamp was a harsh mistress, and power attracts attention. She would return, feed the willow with her rituals, bind spirits to guard it, and weave more layers of deception and danger. Each step ensured that the trap she had created was not merely a punishment, but an enduring fortress, a testament to her dark art. The night held its breath, the willow trembled gently in the mist, and Gredja vanished into the swamp, her silhouette melding with the shadows. She left behind the whisper of the oath, the living blood of her magic, and the knowledge that the warlock would never walk the world again. He was root. He was tree. He was debt made flesh, now carved into eternity. The swamp was still, though its stillness was deceptive. Even after the warlock had been fully bound to the dying willow, Gredja knew that magic like this never went unnoticed. A single, careless mage, a wandering adventurer, or a curious scholar could disrupt her meticulous work, unraveling decades of preparation in a heartbeat. She could not allow that. The first step was observation. Gredja crouched near the willow, letting her senses extend outward through the tangled reeds, the muck, and the brackish water. She closed her eyes and let her awareness drift with the roots that sprawled like serpents into the swamp. Every sound, every movement, every whisper of life came into focus. The fog, normally dense enough to obscure even the stoutest figure, bent around. Her consciousness, revealing shapes and shadows invisible to the naked eye. From this vantage, she could see the faint shimmer of the circle she had drawn, her blood still faintly glowing in the moonlight. The runes carved into the bark pulsed like tiny heart-like rhythms. The willow trembled in acknowledgement of her presence, a sentinel aware that its mistress had returned to ensure the integrity of its prison. Summoning the spirits. Gredja's first layer of defense was not physical, but spiritual. She began a chant in the old tongue, each syllable drawn from memory, woven with her own blood magic. The words called to the lingering spirits of the swamp, restless souls, drowned, children, lost travelers, and creatures that had perished in these waters. Some were harmless, some malevolent, all of them potent when bound to her will. She poured a vial of her blood onto the mud surrounding the willow, letting it seep into the roots. The blood acted as both beacon and leash, drawing spirits toward her. As she chanted, ghostly figures emerged from the fog, translucent, shifting, some appearing as pale humans, others as grotesque animal forms, their edges flickering in and out of focus. They circled the willow, moving with the swaying rhythm of the waterlogged reeds. Guardians of the dead, sentinels of the forgotten, I bind you to my will. Watch, listen, and punish any who would disturb this tree. The spirits shivered, their forms solidifying. Eyes glimmered from skeletal faces, claws dipped into spectral blood. They tested the air, sniffing for intruders, reacting instinctively to any movement or sound. Some moaned softly, weaving a soundscape of despair that would be the first warning to any who approached unprepared. Others wove through the roots and branches, invisible but ever present, ready to lash at those foolish enough to enter the circle. Gredja fed them further, offering bits of her own energy, a single strand of her lifeblood wrapped around each spirit, tethering them permanently to her will, yet allowing them autonomy in pursuit and defense. With every heartbeat, their vigilance sharpened, their forms grew more terrifying, more unpredictable. Constructing the wards. Once the spirits were bound, Gredja turned to runic protection. The willow itself became her canvas. Using a small bone stylus, and her own blood as ink, she etched intricate patterns into the bark, spiraling upward from roots to branches. Each rune served a dual purpose. Deflection. Any spell cast to undo the binding would bounce back with amplified force, potentially harming the caster. Containment. The willow's essence would react violently to any attempt to cut, burn, or physically manipulate it. The runes were ancient, derived from the long-lost dialect of a witch's conclave, predating even her own ancestors. Each line twisted and looped in ways that seemed nonsensical to the untrained eye, but in magical terms, they formed a lattice of unbreakable control. Some of the runes pulsed faintly, creating zones of confusion around the circle. Any mage approaching the tree would experience déjà vu, misremembering which direction they came from, forgetting crucial words mid-incantation, or seeing hallucinatory duplicates of the willow, each more threatening than the last. The psychological component was as crucial as the physical. Fear and doubt would deter most intruders long before any direct confrontation. Gredja whispered incantations to anchor the runes, each word a nail in the coffin of potential trespass. The blood in her palms simmered faintly, feeding the wards and energizing them with her own life essence. The willow absorbed it greedily, growing stronger, more sentient. The sympathetic trap. Next, Gredja employed what she called the sympathetic trap. She placed a mirror nearby, polished from blackened silver, its surface perfectly still. Into it, she carved a fragment of her soul, a tether connecting the mirror, herself, and the willow. Anyone who attempted to harm the tree would see their reflection in the mirror, not as they were, but twisted, contorted, and reflecting the curses she had woven. A slash at the willow would result in the intruder seeing themselves age decades in an instant. A fire would ignite their own limbs with phantom flames. Any attempt to destroy the circle would summon visions of death, fear, and despair. The mirror became a psychological extension of the willow's defenses, a sentinel that punished the mind before the body. Gredja laughed softly as she watched the mirror reflect nothing but fog, knowing it would be the first harbinger of terror for the foolish who dared approach. Feeding the swamp. Gredja's magic did not stop at wards and spirits. The environment itself became a weapon. She began cultivating the swamp around the willow, feeding it with poisons, dead animal flesh, and cursed offerings. The mud thickened, sinking boots and trapping legs. Thorned reeds sprouted along the paths that approached the circle, bending and twisting to ensnare anyone who tried to force their way forward. Hidden sinkholes and bogs opened subtly under the weight of an unsuspecting trespasser. The swamp's waters became a sensory extension of the willow's defenses, sensing vibrations, heat, and magical auras. Even small movements triggered pulses of psychic feedback, disorienting intruders, sapping their strength before they could reach the tree. Gredja smiled, running her fingers along the muck. She could feel the warlock within the willow sensing the change too, his essence reacting to the protective growth. Twisted, gnarled, yet aware, he now played an unwilling part in defending himself, feeding the magic back into the swamp and the willow, layering elemental wards. Next, Gredja incorporated elemental defenses. She drew on her years of study, blending swamp elementalism with blood magic. The air around the willow thickened, charged with latent electricity that would flare unpredictably if approached recklessly. Water in the swamp could solidify into sharp crystalline structures, impaling feet or arms of the intruder. Even the mud itself could rise as writhing tendrils, wrapping and constricting. Fire was subtle, but effective. A faint, unseen flame could spring from the bark if the tree were attacked directly. The flames were magical, feeding on the energy of any hostile presence rather than burning the willow itself. Smoke could cloud vision, filled with hallucinogenic spores drawn from the swamp, disorienting intruders and amplifying fear. These elemental defenses were attuned to the runes and spirits, creating a seamless layered defense network. No single element was dominant. Together, they became a chaotic, terrifying symphony of deterrence, binding the consciousness of the warlock. Gredja's final and most insidious layer of defense involved the warlock himself. Though he was trapped in the willow, a flicker of consciousness remained, enough to resist, to think, to feel. She tied his awareness to the defensive network. If the willow or swamp were tampered with, he would experience the pain, fear, and panic of the intruder. This sympathetic bond made the warlock a living extension of the trap. Anyone trying to destroy or unbind him would trigger reactions from his twisted essence, screams of agony that echoed through the swamp, psychic attacks that blurred reality, and physical reflexes that caused roots to lash out with inhuman speed. The warlock's consciousness became a weapon against meddling, an eternal guardian forged from his own life force, now serving Gredja's will. It was cruel, brilliant, and terrifying in equal measure. The final inspection. Gredja stepped back, taking in the willow and the swamp around it. The circle was complete. Spirits flitted through the fog, invisible to casual observers, but ever present. The runes pulsed faintly along the trunk and roots. The swamp itself had become an extension of the tree, responsive and hostile. The mirror reflected nothing but the mist now, but anyone foolish enough to attempt interference would see nightmares beyond imagining. She traced the outline of the circle one final time with her staff, whispering a low chant to synchronize all layers of defense. Each component, ward, spirit, swamp, elemental force, sympathetic trap, was linked, creating a web that was nearly impossible to unravel. Even the most experienced sorcerer would hesitate, sensing the immense power and danger. Gredja let herself relax slightly. Her hands were sticky with blood, sap and mud. Her hair clung to her face. She had poured herself into this work, and yet she knew it was only the beginning. The swamp would need continual feeding, the spirit's constant vigilance, and the rune's periodic reinforcement. Magic, after all, was never truly static. It demanded attention, sacrifice, and cunning. Long-term maintenance. Over the following nights, she performed smaller, less conspicuous rituals to maintain the trap. Tiny offerings of fish, small birds, and her own blood strengthened the warded circle. Spirits were reinforced, reminding them of their allegiance. Runic tattoos in the bark were refreshed with chants and blood, keeping their magic potent. She also prepared contingencies. If an intruder somehow bypassed the spirits or elemental defenses, minor illusions would guide them into bogs or thorn traps. Whispering voices would drive them in circles, while phantoms would materialize from fog to warn or terrify them. Every possible vector of intrusion had a countermeasure. The willow became more than a prison, it was a fortress. Its branches reached higher, its roots sank deeper, and the warlock within, though trapped, contributed to its defenses. The swamp itself had become a living extension of her will, as loyal and as dangerous as any sentinel she had ever commanded. The swamp held its breath. The fog drifted lazily, but it was a deliberate mask, hiding the horrors within. Beneath its surface, the willow pulsed with trapped life, surrounded by spirits, wards, illusions, and natural traps. Gredja's work was complete. For now. She smiled, the corners of her mouth tinged with satisfaction, and whispered to the swamp. Let none find him. Let none survive who would meddle. And let those who dare remember my name and fear it. The air vibrated with her words, carried through roots, leaves and water, embedding her command into every molecule of the swamp. Gredja stepped back into the fog, leaving behind a fortress of nature, magic and horror, a trap that would endure for decades, centuries, perhaps even eternity.